Now, our next talk, having listened to what the African family is, what it does, its problems, its asset, its existence as an asset, naturally, another important institution that we need to talk about is marriage. It is an issue that is important to Africans, to many people, although these days in Western society, people are beginning to have other kinds of arrangements which do not exactly qualify to be called marriage. Marriage is important because it's also a gender issue. We are going to look at the different types and forms of marriage. And in that context, we look at what I refer to as exotic marriages, and these include infant betrothals, widow inheritance, ghost marriages, sister exchange, and so on. I'm also going to take a look at certain rules that pertain to marriage and sexual behavior. And these rules I can discuss under exogamy and endogamy, as well as incest. And the discussion will end by looking at this issue they call Bridewell. So, marriage, what exactly is it? Well, somebody must have a definition of what it is. And as academics, we look at an old definition going back to 1950, which is found in Notes and Queries. And in Notes and Queries, the definition is that it is a union between a man and a woman, such that children born to the woman are recognized legitimate offspring of both partners. Okay? Now, if you take this definition and reading between the lines, you can see that it has a number of implications. One is that when you talk about marriage, you're talking about a pairing of two individuals. Number two, you are talking about individuals who are alive. Number three, you are talking about two individuals who are of opposite sexes. Number four, you're talking about adults. And number five, the objective of the whole institution is reproduction, to have children. The traditional definition, unfortunately, does not apply universally. If you ask a Catholic, if you go to a Catholic church and you ask, they will tell you that definition is fine. They have no problem with it. Okay? They agree entirely with that definition. But there are also reasons why the definition is not satisfactory. From the African perspective, when you're talking about an African marriage, does it always involve two individuals? Okay? A bride and a groom? No. It also involves their respective families. You can't leave their families out. It's not just individuals. Individuals don't have the right to go and sit somewhere and say they are married. No. If their families are not part of it, please, from the African perspective, it's no marriage. Number two, we also find certain kinds of unusual or what I call exotic forms of marriage that exist in Africa. And African people consider them as marriages. So, for example, we talk about child betrothal. It happens in a number of African societies where an infant may be given out to somebody as his wife. We're also talking about a case where a woman can marry another woman. Okay? And when we're talking about a woman marrying another woman, we are not talking about what happens in other societies where lesbians are marrying each other. These people are not lesbians. Okay? And yet, one woman can marry another woman. Okay? And that is fine. There's no lesbian anything. They don't sleep together. There is also the issue of ghost marriages. A woman may be married to a person who is already dead and therefore a ghost. Africans allow for that. Going beyond that, you have what we call secondary marriages. One of them is widow inheritance, okay, where the deceased husband's brother now marries the widow, okay. But as that can happen, it is also possible for the widower also to be inherited. Okay, it's not only the widow can be inherited, the widower can also be inherited. And in African discussions and sociology, we refer to that as sororate. Okay, it exists. So there's a levirate where the widow is required to procreate with a deceased husband's relative, usually a junior brother. Then beyond that, you've got what we call polygyny. And this is the practice where men are allowed to marry more than one wife. This used to be very common in African societies. To the extent that in some systems, wives themselves bring their daughters, their sisters in, or their cousins and whatnot, to be married to the husband. And this, in fact, used to be the ideal form of marriage in some African societies. Beyond that, there is what we call cohabitation. Now, traditionally, from African perspectives, cohabitation is not recognized as a marriage. But from the perspective of the law, and there is a law called the Property Rights of Spouses Bill. Now, that law actually makes cohabitation a marriage. It refers, cohabitation, we can say, refers to a situation in which a man and a woman hold themselves out to the public to be husband and wife, okay? To the public, they are husband and wife, but they haven't gone through the necessary rituals, the necessary processes to be so. They just live together, and they are doing things as if they are man and wife, but they are not seen as man and wife. That is what is meant by cohabitation. So, and the law says that persons who have cohabited for a period of 5 years or more shall be deemed to be spouses and have the rights of spouses for the purposes of this Act, Act 2. So in other words, what the Act has actually done is to convert cohabitation so long as it has lasted for 5 years. So from the perspective of the lawmakers, when a man and a woman have lived together for 5 years and they are not married, in the eyes of the law, they are deemed to be married. So, but the question that I want to ask is, how acceptable are these exotic marriages that we're talking about? And to answer this question, we should ask, do these forms of marriage infringe rights or deny choices? Do any of them involve coercion, forcing people into marriages they object to? Do these marriages pose problems for any of the parties, whether you talk about a couple or their children? And I'm afraid if the answer to any of these is yes, then we have legitimate concerns when we're talking about development, because development does support choice, does enable people to exercise choice and not be compelled to do things that they don't want to do, unless, of course, there are serious reasons why that should be so. So one thing about marriage is that it establishes rights and obligations between the couple as well as between their families too, okay? And these are regulated by social and customary norms. The accession and management of these rights and obligations has implications for well-being of the individuals, their spouses, their children, as well as their kin. Now, let me take the question of polygyny. Polygyny is where a man takes more than one wife. But that is called bigamy in the West. In Western societies, it is bigamy if you have more than one wife, and it's illegal. You are arrested and prosecuted. But the question that we may also ask when we are looking at all these things from a perspective of choice is, does polygyny deny any choices? Okay? Christianity may object to polygyny, but Islam does not. Okay? And you may well ask, if Western society does allow homosexual marriage, if that is allowed, why is it that they are saying that polygyny is not allowed? What is wrong with polygyny? If homosexual marriage is allowed, because they say it is their choice, why can't a man marry 2 wives, 3 wives, 4 wives, if the women want it that way? Okay? So there is a contradiction here. Many people condemn polygyny for being unfair to women. Maybe it's true. For militating against the interests of women. Maybe it's true. But some people, including women also, see nothing wrong with it. Okay? Now, I like to cite the case of Kenya. Kenya has just passed a law. It says that, I just took this from the net. It says that MPs voted into law the practice of men having more than one wife. So in Kenya, the law is there. A man can have as many wives as he likes. Traditionally, the husband needed the consent of the first wife to take a second wife. But the law has now even denied this consent. Now, a man doesn't need any consent from the wife to marry another wife. A husband can go and take another wife, and the law allows for that. And President Uhuru Kenyatta has just signed that law, that law, and it now exists. Of course, it's not all Kenyans who agree. The women were up in arms against it, but well, it has been signed into law. So while Kenya has legalized polygyny, it appears that Malawi wants to ban it. Okay? So the Minister for Gender Studies, for gender in Malawi, says that a ban is necessary to prevent women from being abused by men. Yeah, and she says that problems occur because men could not give their full attention to more than one wife. So while the Minister for Gender is saying this, the spokesperson for the Muslim Association of Malawi has come out and said that, look, this proposed law will discriminate against the country's Muslim minority. In other words, as far as the Muslims are concerned, well, it's discriminated against their rights. If you say they cannot have more than one wife, okay? And what is interesting is that it goes on to say that about 6% more women than men in Malawi. If polygamy were banned, many women will be left without a husband and become prostitutes. Of course, I don't agree with that. Now, the perceptions of polygyny as good. Some say that's good, and they advance a number of reasons why they think it's good. Yeah. But of course, questions can also be raised about polygyny. See, if you're saying that a man can marry more than one wife, the question is that man able to meet all the expectations, emotional, economic, and so on and so forth of his wives? Is that what we're saying? Maybe some men can, maybe some men can't. Yet they want to be married to more than one wife so that they leave the other wives and concentrate on one. So that is where the argument also lies. And some will say that it brings about wasteful competition between women. Co-wives tend to compete against each other. One woman is demanding a cloth from the husband, the other wife wants a cloth, in fact, even a better one. So it goes on and on like that. So these are also reasons for objecting to it. But the question that we need to ask ourselves from the cultural perspective is, what were the reasons why Africans even marry at all? Europeans say now you don't need to marry. But Africans traditionally insisted that you needed to marry. And you needed to marry because marriage confers status and prestige and recognition on the married partners. Okay? So in many African societies, even today, you don't get full respect if you are married as an adult. And marriage was seen in the past as a rite of passage, such that everybody was expected to marry. If you didn't marry, you were still considered as a child. You were not a responsible citizen. Beyond that, there were economic reasons. In the past, there was a rigid division of labor according to sex. There were certain activities only men could do, certain activities that only women could do. So for a man to enjoy a full life, it meant he had to be married. The same also applied to a woman. Of course, other reasons we shouldn't deny are love and companionship. And that explains why an old couple will marry. They're married because of they really genuinely love each other and there's companionship. As in the case of Mandela and his last wife. So, but procreation is a paramount reason. Okay, the reason why Africans traditionally married was to have children. And that in fact explains why a woman wants to marry another woman. It's not because the woman wants to have sex with her. The woman wants to control the children that the other woman will give birth to. So this issue of procreation was paramount as far as African societies are concerned. Another issue that you may consider important was the question of political alliance. Sometimes a marriage cements an alliance and a bond between two groups, two clans, two lineages, and so on. And it's not surprising that chiefs in the past had many wives. It wasn't because they were sexually more active than others. It was a political requirement, a requirement for alliance for the chief to have all these daughters, people's daughters from all over within the palace, because that is what makes his position, his position as a chief, that what supports it. Okay. Now, beyond all that, when you talk about marriage, you cannot run away from domestic rights abuses. They do occur. Okay. You see, when people come together, there are abuses of various kinds, and these abuses, unfortunately, take a variety of forms. It could be physical abuse, it could be psychological abuse, it could be economic abuse. So examples, of course, will be beatings, threatening language, insults, denigrations, or making the other person look small, denial of the person's needs, rape, killings, torture. Some people are burnt, abandonment, and so on and so forth. These are all domestic rights abuses, and we cannot deny that they do exist. And because they are there and they are rampant, governments have these days now put in place various mechanisms to address them. So in this country, for example, there's a law against it, okay? And there is also institutions like WAJU, which later became DOFSU. So these organizations are there to ensure that these domestic rights abuses are minimized. So let me go back and look at the question of wife inheritance. This is something which has been debated in this country. Yeah. Wife inheritance has a reason. Traditionally, it was there because it was meant to guarantee stability to the widow. So your husband has died. So where then do you come in? Why should the lineage continue to support you? One reason why the lineage should continue to support you is that you are married to somebody else within the lineage. So you then are asked or required to marry your husband's brother. And this person who has inherited the property of the husband is the person who is now going to take care of you. So if you look at it from a certain perspective, and let's say that widow inheritance existed traditionally all over Ghana. There's no society where we didn't have that. Akans had it, people in the north had it, and so on and so forth. And some people still practice it even today. Okay? So the intention seemed to be good. But good as it may be, the question that needs to be asked from our perspective, because we're interested in development, is there coercion involved? Are people being made to choose for themselves who they want to marry? The answer is that in some systems, the widow can choose from among the dead person's junior brothers, whichever of them he or she wants to marry. And if she was unwilling, she was not compelled. Okay? If you don't want any of them, fine. You can continue living and taking care of yourself. Nobody cares. Okay? But they advise that you take one of them. But you can decide that I don't want to be married to them. I want to remain a widow. Some systems, even in this country, allow for that. Okay? But let me say that there are some systems where that was not allowed. And I was just reading from the media the other day, the case of 4 brothers in a part of this country, in the Upper East, who brutally assaulted their late brother's widow for refusing to marry any of them. So what happened? They marched to her house and subjected her to beatings until she became unconscious. Using sticks and cudgels and belts and ropes, they hit the widow all over the body amid accusations and shouts of prostitute, away, you can't kill us, go away, and so on and so forth. So this is to tell you, this is a recent report. It's not, I think it's dated 2015. Okay, so it's very recent. So these things still happen. So in some cases, the widow is actually forced. But in some cases, the widow has a choice. She can choose for herself whether she wants to be married to one of the brothers or not. Number 2, or even whether she wants to be married to anyone at all. That's her choice. But you see, while we concentrate, the gender activists often concentrate on the widow's side. Maybe we should also pause and ask, what about the man's side? You see, shouldn't we ask whether this brother who is being asked to take the widow really wants to do that or not, or is being compelled? And sometimes a brother is compelled to marry his deceased brother's widow because the widow says, I want you, you see. What about if this man is already married and he does want a second wife? What about if the widow is too old for him? Yeah. What about if he's a Christian and he doesn't want to have more than one wife? So these are also questions that we should also turn around and ask. Shouldn't ask the question just one way all the time. So sometimes also the widows they are subject to all kinds of rituals. Again, we are talking about laws in this country to prevent these things. But let us also pause again. In the case of Malawi, these things happen. And it is reported that a widow is expected to have sexual relations in order to cleanse herself. There is a belief that if she does not sleep with someone, the spirit of the dead husband will come and visit upon her, and her family will be cursed. The practice is not forced upon the widows. Instead, the tradition has become so much part of the culture that widows themselves call for it. They are quoted as saying, "I don't want to die. I don't want a curse to come to my husband. Don't cry." And it says that they cry to be allowed to be cleansed. So it's interesting that some of these so-called rituals that we say we should ban, maybe we need to know something a little more about it, because sometimes the widows want it. You see, you want to ban it because you think it's bad. The widow wants it, it is good. So the question of infant betrothal is also something that we need to look at. It has its dangers, okay? Now, where is the choice? If you're saying that in development there's a choice, for this infant, where is the choice? Where the child doesn't know anything, she doesn't know her left from her right, and she's being asked to marry an older person. There's no choice there. And in some cases, it leads to elopements. People run away with a teenager when she gets to that stage. It also means that in some cases, teenagers are forced into marriage because she has been betrothed to someone as the person's wife. The person may be in a hurry to put her in the family way before somebody snatches her. So what happens? Teenage marriage, teenage pregnancies, okay? School dropouts, some of them drop out of school, okay? They become teenage mothers. They can't fend for their children because they don't know how. They're too young for it. And of course, because they become mothers too early, the question of poor health for the mother and child also crops up. So these are also issues that are very critical. Now, before we conclude this lecture, let us consider the question of rules. As I pointed out, there are rules and regulations. Some of the rules are rules that regulate a choice, who you may marry or may not marry, okay? Who you may have sex with or may not have sex with. So the rule which prescribes that you cannot marry within the group that you belong is called the rule of exogamy. Related to the rule of exogamy is incest. Incest, the rule says that you cannot have sex with certain people because they are related to you, okay? Yeah. So if development is about a choice, then the question that we have to ask is whether exogamy and incest, and to a certain extent endogamy, affect marriage choices. And if the answer is yes, and the answer indeed is yes, then we have a reason to consider these kinds of relationships. Yeah. In the case of incest, some people will say it's a good thing, and maybe because we don't take these things seriously these days, we hear about all these unnecessary sexual encounters between child defilement cases, between adults who are related to the children that they have defiled. Some people argue that it's because we don't take these laws, traditional laws of incest, into account. That is why a father may sleep with a daughter, a brother may try to do something with a close, and so on and so forth. Maybe there's a point in that. Now, as we try to conclude, we look at the question of Bridewell. And the question is, to give or not to give Bridewell? What is it to begin with? Bridewell, I would say, are customary items that wife takers are required to give to wife givers, okay? The person who is giving you a wife, you also settle items of property on that person. That is what we call wife givers. And the diagram makes it clear. It's a flow from wife takers to wife givers. Now, we can contrast this with dowry. In this country, we talk about dowry, but really it's not dowry, which is Bridewell we're talking about. In the case of dowry, it is the items that the wife giver gives to the wife taker. Okay, so you take somebody's daughter, you also take property from the person. That is what we call dowry. Okay, so both of them, of course, have their implications. Okay, but the question about Bridewell, since that is predominant in sub-Saharan Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa is Bridewell we have. Dowry is not, is minimal. We don't see dowry often. Okay, it's the northern part that they have dowry, in India and those places. But in sub-Saharan Africa, that is where you're talking about dowry. And some societies have it, some societies do not have it, or even if they have it at all, it's not mandatory. Okay? So the point about Bridewell is that marriage itself may lack legitimacy and social recognition if the bride wealth has not been settled. Okay? If the husband has not gone through all this, it means that there's no marriage. And that has repercussions on the spouses themselves as well as on their children. So what does it do? Number one, it legitimizes the marriage. Because you've settled bride wealth, everybody knows that you are now living together as man and wife. It's not cohabitation anymore. It has documentary value. It documents the relationship. In the past, when we didn't have registers to sign and so on and so forth, it was the Bridewell which served as a register. Okay, the cattle that you gave, in the case of societies that provide cattle, remain for a long time, and they continue to be a testimony to the marriage relationship. So they were like the paper on which we write or register our marriages. They also served as compensation as far as the bride's family is concerned. Let's not forget that they are losing their daughter. And not only are they losing their daughter and her labor, her potential of bringing up children is lost to her own family. It's some other family which benefits. Therefore, compensate them. That is what Bridewell does also. So a husband can claim paternity rights over the issues born to his wife because he has settled the Bridewell. So the fact that you have slept with the woman and you have fathered the children biologically doesn't make the children your children until you settle the Bridewell. It also enables families to replace the woman who has gone out. I've lost a daughter, but the Bridewell that I get enables me to go and get another girl for my son. So it enables a kind of exchange. Okay? So what goes into a Bridewell? Very interesting. Very often it's an assortment of things in agreed quantities. Okay? And this differs from society to society. Some use livestock, cattle, goats, sheep, and so on. Some use consumables, foodstuffs, alcoholic beverages, salt, and so on. Some use cash, money. Some give cloth, manufactured cloth, traditional cloth. Some provide labor on the farm. Some give unusual items, okay, which may no longer be available, like cowrie shells, traditional metal goods, special traditional cloth, like back cloth in the Congo, and so on and so forth. So many things go into it. And that is where Bridewell also becomes an issue, okay? Now, it can become a perceived issue because of the quantum of items that are demanded. How much are they asking? They're asking, if you go to some societies, like among the cattle rearing people in the Sudan traditionally, they can ask for up to 40 heads of cattle. Where does a Ghanaian get all those 40 heads of cattle if you're interested in a Dinka wife? It becomes a problem, okay? Yeah, of course, if you're a Dinka, you get them. Affordability. They're asking all that, is it affordable for the person who wants their daughter? Are they available, the items that we're talking about? If you're asking for some ancient products, I don't have them. Where am I going to get them to secure my wife? Big question. The answers to these questions do vary from society to society. In some societies, Bridewell is not an issue. It may just be a token. There's nothing much to it. In some societies, it is not a token. It's a huge settlement that you have to make. So in a sense, this is where we like to end the discussion on marriage. Sorry, it has to be rushed because there's a lot to say. If you don't rush, you can say it all.